Okay, good afternoon. My name is Maria Jose Hierro, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Yale. And I'm also affiliated to the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies at Yale. I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar Women's Groups Waving Truths in Conflict Scenarios on behalf of the Yale Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies, the European Studies Council, and the Program on Peace and Development, which are the sponsors for this event in partnership with the Latin American Interdisciplinary Gender Network. It is a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Arantxa Garcia del Soto, whom I've known for 25 years now in many different facets as a friend, an academic, and as a human rights fighter. Arantxa has worked with victims of war and structural violence since 1993. She's currently accompanying human rights defenders in Honduras and Colombia, providing them with online psychosocial support and collaborating with Equitas in Colombia and UNATE in Cantabria. Until December 2019, she worked for the Colombian Truth Commission within its exile team, coordinating the work with the Colombian victims or survivors in Europe and the US under the supervision of the Commissioner Carlos Bernstein. Today, Arantxa will share with us some of her experience in working with truth commissions, works courts, and people's tribunals in post-conflict scenarios. She will bring in several examples of women's groups from Latin America and Europe that have experienced wars and forced migration, and she will explain for us what tools she has used in her work to promote the visibility and dignity of victims of conflict. Following Arantxa's talk, we will have some time for Q&A, so please enter your questions in the chat, and I can read them and translate if need be for Arantxa after her talk. The recording of the event, in case you have to leave earlier, will be available on the councils, on the Latin American and Iberian Council and the European Studies Council, and also on the Program on Peace and Development. So you can access this talk later on. And without further ado, Arantxa, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, although it's almost nighttime here in Madrid, and thank you so much for having me today. I feel so grateful also to the Yale Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies, the European Studies Council, and the Program for Peace and Development for sponsoring the webinar, just as Professor Hierro just said. Last time I was at the Macmillan Center in person was more than 10 years ago, and we were sharing about international work on exhumations and disappearances. Thank you especially to Professor Maria Jose Hierro and Asia for all their support to make this seminar possible. I also want to thank Dr. Roy Idelson for teaching me how not to mispronounce Yale many years ago, apart from teaching me many other very useful cultural tips. In this first slide, I'm sharing the picture of these Afghan migrant and asylum seeker girls in Greece, in the port of Athens. The picture belongs to Henry Konak, and I will be giving credit to most of the pictures, if they are not mine, through the talk. And if I don't, please ask me at the end, because of course I do have the permission of those pictures that do not belong to our own work. Let me see. Okay. My proposal for our trip together this afternoon is the following. Sharing work realities with survivors of ethnopolitical and gender violence in different contexts, having had the opportunity to witness and accompany several grassroots initiatives. Ultimately, I want to talk about applied knowledge on women's groups in the so-called post-conflict scenarios, mostly women with a few references to other gender identities and orientations. The term transitional is bound to formal initiatives linked to institutions already established. And by transnational, here, I want to refer to collective work shaped up by the victims / survivors / protagonists themselves. Collective initiatives that start small and humble, not formally institutional, and usually non-legal, which end up crossing borders out of their need to make visible realities that are not considered even in transitional political designs. I chose 4 case studies. These are the ones: the Women's Court in the Balkans, People's Permanent Tribunal and its consideration of the gender cases, the Colombian Truth and Reconciliation Commission through the women's groups in exile. Hopefully we can have a little break with music, not more than 3 minutes here. And the last case study is Women Migrant Cooperatives in Athens, Greece. I'm very aware that this might be too much information, and I chose these 4 cases over analyzing in depth just 1 or 2. Why so? In the hope that part of this info might connect with some of your research and professional interests. Last, of course, I really look forward to your questions and reflections, and also to your suggestions regarding the next step to follow up on similar work. One minor disclosure now. Guatemala is not formally included, but it is present in the references that I will be sharing at the end. And we can hopefully keep in touch through email to expand on some of your personal interests if you feel like doing so. Here we go. The persons that are protagonists of this seminar are mostly women that have experienced different forms of violence, generally in ethnopolitical conflict scenarios or guerrilla and counter-guerrilla, insurgency and counter-insurgency, guerrilla and paramilitary groups scenarios. These women are the top experts on the impacts of violence. You can read by yourself this quote about the specific meanings of peace for some women from Liberia, which might apply to many other impoverished places around the world. Violence tends to impact women in the following way. This might sound like overgeneralizing, but I wanted to share with you some of the patterns of violence that we've been able to witness and accompany in different places around the world. Men become warriors. They leave home to take up the weapons and fight in the war fronts, while women are pushed to become, on top of the role of emotional providers within the family, economic providers, along with acquiring new abilities and responsibility. This means that their gender roles are changing. And this means that many men start feeling that the women they left behind before going to the war fronts are not the same persons they were sharing their lives with. In many cases, this brings about what we call the second waves of violence. And usually this is domestic violence, unfortunately. Of course, all this also has impacts on the younger generations. In some cases, in the so-called post-conflict scenarios, the younger generations tend to get better education and, of course, freer lives somehow. In other cases, they are just also very much impacted in different ways, also by the violence. There is something that we call intergenerational pain that we work with also when dealing with these post-conflict scenarios. Going back to these changes in the gender roles, it is important to understand the impacts on masculinities and patriarchal societies overall, because of the questioning and the push to understand and integrate these new roles and the empowerment of women, as I just tried to describe it. In this slide, you can see one of the mothers of Srebrenica. Srebrenica in Bosnia was the largest massacre in Europe after World War II. To the right, you can see this mother 20 years after the massive killing that took place back in 1995. To the left, same person back in 1995. the same year she lost her son. I will describe few realities that are oriented by the experience and activism of women survivors groups. This approach is closer to anthropology. Then there is the attempt to make sense out of it under a more rigorous analysis and the ultimate need to disseminate the experiences and the messages of the protagonist, the people we work with. This process of collecting testimonies and trying to accompany the people that have been impacted by violence is probably explained by my own professional trajectory, starting in social psychology and sociology, immersing myself first in humanitarian and psychosocial work, to later keep on moving towards human rights work. Human rights work, we need to be aware, can also be questioned because of its Western and mono-unidisciplinary tendencies when trying to answer the complexity of the realities of the survivors. I have had the opportunity of accompanying the survivors from my personal privileged situation, my educational background, access to networks, and having other resources such as the time and the money to travel, and the possibilities to following up and keeping in touch while witnesses some of these women, and some men also. I also had the privilege of witnessing them, many of them, become powerful survivors and protagonists and recognized activists. The focus in this seminar is first on non-judicial examples. Although we tend to work with a lot of lawyers, most of the case studies are around non-legal institutions. Second, the focus is on feminist justice decided mostly by grassroots women's movements with different approaches to feminism and gender issues. Overall, we talk about feminisms with an S at the end. But all of them put mutual support over institutional formalities and legal rules. Third, there's a very clear and rounded continuum that goes from local to international and then local again, facilitated by today's connected world that promotes dissemination and networking, which is crucial for the realities of these grassroots women's groups. Ultimately, the core of this work with different communities is based on listening and supporting the meaning making, the goals of the different women who want to overcome the impacts of violence as they find these goals by themselves. Listening and trying to truly understand the meaning making of the paths that these women want to put in front of themselves. Here we have an example of the declaration of rape as a war crime under international humanitarian law. It took place in the year 2000 in the Balkans. And it so happened thanks to the interdisciplinary efforts of lawyers, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, people with non-formal diplomas. So it was all bringing together academia and also grassroots movements, collecting testimonies from women that experience sexual violence and bringing all of this to the Hague Tribunal. It all ended up with this declaration of rape as a war crime. And it's one of our successful examples after years of work. When we talk about transitional justice, its formal definition correlates with the increased formalities within the institutions implementing socio-political changes after conflict. As you can see here, these transitional justice mechanisms claim to be linked to the dignity of the survivors, and the transitional justice responses are based on what we call reparations. The main terms under this discipline, we all know them, right? Truth, justice, reparations, non-repetition. Transitional justice is also very much linked to the understanding of the reasons of the different conflicts. what we call in Spanish esclarecimiento, as it is phrased in the latest Truth Commission in the planet, the Colombian Truth Commission, or Comisión para el Esclarecimiento de la Verdad. But transitional justice has its own challenges. Some people claim that it's too Western, North-oriented, and it ignores first the diversity of cultural and indigenous approaches, and the Gachachas tribunals in Rwanda is one of the classical examples trying to answer this first criticism. Second, transitional justice is also criticized because it says, to be dismissive of other contextual realities such as poverty and shame and the traumas experienced by the survivors. And these shame and traumas require personal timing needed to be ready to share the private experience of violence. Each person, each one of us has a different timing regarding our own psychological realities when trying to share our pains and when trying to overcome those. Transitional justice sometimes shows this tendency to put all pains under the same approaches. Under transitional justice, the idea of justice is very much linked to judicial solutions as well, right? And the truth seeking is very much connected to memory. And here we do have another conflict. Why? Because memory is based on the sharing of personal accounts that are always questionable when confronted with truths that are evidence-based and rely mostly on historical facts. Testimonies are always crucial under transitional justice and under any other approaches to work with survivors. And feminist justice still today tends to take place where states and international institutions, such as some of the UN agencies, do not comply with the diversity and the complexity of the daily realities of the survivors. This is why we claim that transitional justice might be very useful when trying to give an answer to the realities of women and women's groups, but not only. And this is why we call for other options and we are trying to exemplarize those, okay? Basically, what I'm trying to underline here is that the complex social and political realities that survivors go through call on us in order to consider the groups that tend to be excluded. The timing needed by the survivors is very important. We need to take it into account. And again, the meaning making that they convey to us, it's one of the main tools we need to work with. At the end, it's all about the sustainability and how we accompany the people and how we follow up those cases towards, if not well-being, at least better being from their own grassroots bottom-up initiatives. Okay, and now I'm going to ask you to buckle up because we are going to start the trip through these 4 cases. The very first stop is the stop in the Balkans, okay? The conflict in the Balkans was defined as an ethno-political conflict. And only today, 26 years after the formal peace solutions, mostly imposed by the US and some European countries, we still find structural violence in the Balkans. Very simple examples. We have one Bosnian activist, Savina Talovic, that has been threatened in the recent weeks. And we have groups of women, as women in Black in Serbia, that keep on being threatened again. I will share a few examples in a few minutes as well. What I'm trying to say is that even after Dayton Peace Accord, things are not going that well in the Balkans. I already shared with you the successful example of the declaration of rape as a war crime that took place because of the conflict somehow. And the example that I chose to share with you here is the Women's Court that took place in Sarajevo 20 years after the Dayton Peace Accord. The Women's Court in the Balkans let me try to define it, but first going back again to somehow the nature of the conflict. I already talked about the Srebrenica massacre, where more than 3,000 men were killed in 3 days. The perpetrators did a wonderful, horrifying work there. The men were aged between 16 and 65 years old, though some of them were older and some of them were younger. And during the conflict in the Balkans, cultural heritage was destroyed, as in many other conflicts, and the impacts took place on different generations, of course. And here we have pictures took by ourselves. Inma Serrano is the author of many of these pictures of the mothers of Srebrenica that were sheltered in Tuzla, a close by location city, somehow mimicking the example of some other mothers of victims. Probably you have in mind the example of Mothers de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina. What they did in Tuzla was getting together once a week, usually on Thursday, sharing the same universal messages that mothers of victims do. We do not forget, we are looking for our missing ones. And those messages have an impact even in the younger generation. For example, this girl wasn't born during the Srebrenica massacre, but out of the socio-political environment, still she's part somehow of these weekly demonstrations. The Women's Court that took place back in 2015 relied on the previous 3 years of preparations. It was mostly the women from the Organization of Women in Black that were working in very small villages and also in larger cities, holding meetings with other women in order to prepare them to share their experiences during the conflict, to ultimately come to Sarajevo in May. I believe it was in May or the beginning of June, yeah, to share their testimonies in a more visible international way. The basic principles for the Women's Court were the following, as you can read by yourselves here. Feminist justice, precisely because the 6 states of the Balkans were not complying with the justice that they were supposed to be holding for their citizens. And women from all the 6 states got together after all these years of preparations. So there were women from Bosnia, from Croatia, from Serbia, from Macedonia, from Slovenia, and from Kosovo. The basics for the event that lasted for 2.5 days in Sarajevo were very simple. Listening with deep intention. No photos, no cell phones, and personal translation, mostly from the local languages to English, to Spanish, and German. We were trying to do our own translation by being together in smaller groups. The 5 types of crimes we listened at the testimonies were the following. First, the war against civil population. As you can read here, the separation of men and women. The testimonies were also around disappearances, torture, how the families were born apart, displacement, and also there were very intense testimonies about the Srebrenica massacre. How many women, family members, had to go to different places trying to search for the remains of the men that had or were made disappear in their families. The second crime was the fact that women's bodies were used as battlefields. We already talked about the declaration of rape as a war crime, right? But we were listening to women that had experienced themselves sexual violence. The third crime was around the militaristic violence, forced recruitment, the use of drugs in order to promote aggressiveness, and also the sadly usual conflicts among neighbors. The fourth one was referred to the crimes against people from minority groups, mostly Roma people, a large group in the Balkans, and also the LGBTIQ++ communities. And so we also got to listen to what is called intersectionality, women that were Roma and lesbian. The fifth and last grouped crime at the women's court were the economic and social violence crimes, examples from women that belonged to unions and were fired from their works. Do not forget that women had a prevalent role in the Balkan society before the war, right? And their working schedule were made and thought of in order to make very compatible their work inside homes and outside of the homes. So what the war implied was taking a step back because somehow they were dismissed from their working rights and excluded from work. And the workers were much more unprotected, not only during, but mostly after the war here. And all this took place in a context of so-called post-war, where there was and still there is systematic violence. These are some pictures from the women's court that took place in Sarajevo. And the messages in the signs read, the first one: I was left alone, but I keep on fighting, and I know that justice will take place. These two ladies are also mothers from Srebrenica. The sign at the back reads, we are all the same. We have the same pain. We still share that pain. It doesn't matter if we are Bosnians, Serb, or Kosovars. The final recommendations and follow-up of the women course were around the following. First of all, the need to disseminate these realities and the types of crimes among other groups. And this is what I'm trying to do here by sharing this with you today. Also, to set up better strategies against militarization and the privatization of security that is taking place, not only in the Balkans, but almost everywhere around the world. To acknowledge the responsibility of the states, the average citizens that do not want to look at these conflicts, the religious communities, the churches that were also responsible for violence and promoting it among its members, and the business and industries that played a major role also connected to the violence. To also make visible the economic and symbolic reparations that were or were not implemented. Sadly, reparations tend to not be implemented in many post-conflict situations. And also another universal call to make these conflicts visible in the education curricula so that the younger generations can learn about them, okay? More education and less militarism in patriarchal societies. At the end, again, the same core terms we find when we work around justice, reparations, truth, non-repetition, but something very specific of the women's court was solidarity and sorority. Women in Black played a major role organizing the women's court in the previous years of the preparations, but also in the later dissemination. They are still doing wonderful work today. But again, I need to remind you, and please, please expand this information if you can, that this year has been especially tough for them. And still today, right now, they are under threats and raids by Serb radical groups very much connected to the current government of Vučić. More pictures from the women's court, demonstrations in the streets of Sarajevo, the support of Mothers de Plaza de Mayo. Nora is there. She's over 80 years old. She has much more energy than I have and a very strong personality. I can share this with you because I had the opportunity of doing some translation for her. We were not supposed to take pictures, and I'm ashamed to say that I took this picture in the very last session that was very emotional and ended up with lots of sounds. Okay, I hope you're still buckled up here because our next stop, the next case study, is what is called the Permanent People's Tribunal. The Permanent People's Tribunal is today established in Italy. It's currently based in Rome at the Fondazione Basso. And I have to thank Simona Frauditario for being the very first person that taught me about the People's Tribunal. Basically, what they do, and you can see the underline in this slide, is they have wonderful interdisciplinary research, mostly around economic crimes and crimes that are linked to the growing challenges of globalization, okay? They do not hold judicial cases, but they bring together lots of experts who are very well known about these economic crimes from different parts of the world. The origin of the Permanent People's Tribunal is very much linked to the Russell Tribunals. And the Russell Tribunals were founded by philosophers like Bertrand Russell or Jean-Paul Sartre, and later joined by Simone de Beauvoir, Lázaro Cárdenas, the former Mexican president that was very generous with the Spanish losers of the Civil War. And the Russell Tribunals were later on also joined by other writers as Julio Cortázar or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that had a very strong commitment with their countries of origin in Latin America. Some people from the US that were part of these tribunals are people like Peter Weiss, the cinema US director and an artist. This might give you an idea of the diversity of the experts that are very much engaged in these tribunals. For each one of the 44 sessions that they've been holding since it was founded back in 1979, they call on different people, okay? And I was talking to Simona Frauditario, trying to find out about the cases that were more focused on gender, and she answered saying, sadly, not so many. And these are the three main cases around gender that the People's Tribunal has been working on in the last few years. First, there was a declaration on migrants, rights and gender. And if you allowed me to, for just like 3 minutes, I would like to read a little bit about this declaration. You have the links so that maybe during Christmas holiday, if you feel like you can do some deeper research if you are interested. Regarding migrant rights and gender, some of the research was around the following cases: sexual trafficking, and also another purposes of trafficking like labor exploitation, in which women normally embark on a migrant process through smugglers with whom they become in debt, so that when they arrive in the country of destination, they will work as interns or as workers in the home or caring for dependents. Do not forget that these cases of migrant women that have been trafficked as caregivers are also taking place here in Spain now, sadly, very frequently, or even in the US. So they were talking about these types of situations. Also in this first chapter of migrant rights and gender, they were debating and presenting about the situation of the LGBTIQ+ people, saying the following: membership of the LGBTIQ+ group has historically, and even today, been an enormous source of inequality in relations to the compliance with human rights. The imposed heteronormativity, reinforced by the binary approach, raises sexual relations to political relations, used to dominate women and LGBTIQ people. The persecution and discrimination they suffer is developed through control over their sexuality and their identity, by which they are prevented from freely expressing themselves. Therefore, this system entails the systematic violation of the human rights of the LGBTIQ silently and with great impunity. In most cases, the LGBTIQ+ people are denied their request for international protection under the argument that in their country of origin, they can avoid any kind of persecution by hiding their sexual preference or gender identity. I encourage you to also take a look at the conclusions of this first point on migrant rights and gender. But let me now move to the second and the third point. The second point was mostly based on Mexico and the feminicides that are taking place in the region. And the third and last point was, as you can read by yourselves, on the clothing industry and people's living wages. The last chapter on Sri Lanka is very technical, but it's beautifully written, and I encourage you to read it if you find the time. On migration and the Mexico feminicides, you can read here some of the realities that were presented at the Permanent People's Tribunal. Things like, back a few years ago, 20% of more than the 200,000 people crossing the Mediterranean were trafficked. And 12% of the women arriving in Macedonia, many of them from the Middle East, were pregnant. Another reality that was visible there is that the refugee and asylum seekers welcoming centers in Valencia, Spain, work under a sexual division of labor, in the sense that it's only women asylum seekers that are supposed to clean their own cells. And this does not happen to men asylum seekers. And the last point is the one that I just described to you regarding the LGBTIQ people and how they are claimed to be able to avoid persecution, which is crazy when you work with human rights victims. Feminicide, as considered in the case for the People's Tribunal in Mexico, you can see the definition here. It's very much connected always to the killing of women and girls just out of the reality that they are female. Though we need to understand that this definition varies depending on the cultural and the contextual aspects, right? I will also share with you in a few minutes one case of feminicide in Spain that goes all the way back to the Civil War that we are working on right now. And you can read in these points also about some of the figures for feminicide in Latin America. Honduras sadly always tends to hold one of the first positions, while some of these figures are stagnant for places like Argentina and Mexico, as you can see here, right? Lastly, to wrap up this second stop, the second case study, you can see here a group of Mexican women in a community close to Querétaro, where most of the men are migrants in the US. We had the opportunity of working with them also through one colleague, Elodie Hugon. The next stop, our third case study, are the Colombian Colectivos de Mujeres, very much linked to the Colombian Truth Commission. Let me just put some time, short time, trying to define the nature of the conflict in Colombia, as you can read about it in most of the manuals. The Colombian conflict is known to be an insurgency and counterinsurgency conflict. It's been there for over 60 years, and only recently, back in 2018, there was one more supposedly final peace agreement. This last peace agreement has three main pillars, okay? These three main pillars are the unit for the disappearances, the judicial court, and the Truth Commission. In Spanish, there's a very long name for the institutional reality linked to this peace agreement, okay? Sistema Integral de Verdad, Justicia, Reparación y No Repetición. And the three institutions are disappearances, Unidad de Búsqueda para las Personas Dadas por Desaparecidas, HEP, the Judicial Institution, y la Comisión para el Esclarecimiento de la Verdad, the Truth Commission. But of course, before this peace agreement, women had been working many years before. And the Ruta Pacífica, this group of women, is a very good example of really hard, intense work all through the Colombian territory, okay? Here you can see 3 of the top publications of Ruta Pacifica. I will be very happy to share those with you as well. Most of them are translated to English. And again, the importance of translation here to disseminate this work we are talking about is crucial. The first publication is Memory for Life, and it was the very first proposal for a Women's Truth Commission in Colombia. The second one was a very nice way of giving back the first publication to the women that shared their testimonies. And they did so by making abstracts in a confidential way with drawings and pieces of art and bringing those back to even the most remote locations. And the third and last one was the most previous publication before the peace agreement. It was called The Women's Truth, 2 very thick volumes in nice blue colors. Again, a Colombian conflict in which we could find lots, sadly, of girls and boys, children soldiers, with lots of massacres, mostly by the paramilitary, but where you can also find out of the citizens and the nature, the aura of the country, lots of resilience and lots of joy and lots of strength in order to follow the peace lines and to try to make the country stepping into a much better reality. These are some of the murals, pieces of art that you can see in lots of different places in Colombia. Let me focus now on the Truth Commission in its exile team, the exile chapter, first focusing on some of the formal figures that the United Nations shared, okay? So if you follow these formal figures, they talk about a little bit more than 500,000 Colombian refugees all around the world. But if you check different sources from the United Nations, these figures can go all the way up to 5 million, also if you include family members, okay? What the Truth Commission in Colombia decided to do was somehow dividing its chapters through the Colombian territory. And for the very first time at the Truth Commission, one of the chapters was exile, the Colombian out of Colombia, which was wonderful because it was the very first opportunity to make exile and diasporas visible. This is somehow a brief abstract of some of the main principles of the Colombian Truth Commission. Again, here you get to see non-repetition, to bear witness, but also how there is still going an attempt to collect not only individual testimonies, but also to consider collective cases and to do very serious research in order to understand the causes and the patterns that were taking place and are still taking place, sadly enough, because there's still lots of violence going on in Colombia. Only in the last 3 days, 2 very young indigenous leaders have been killed. The final report of the Colombian Truth Commission was due just a couple of weeks ago, after the 3rd year after the peace agreement, but it has been expanded. So people keep on working at the Truth Commission. Within the exile chapter, we had all these different regions out of Colombia, okay? United States and Canada, Central America. We also had Venezuela and Ecuador, which are the 2 places with the largest figures of Colombian exilees. We also had Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, and then we had Europe. I had the privilege, the opportunity of working with different groups in Europe, in the United States, a few in Canada, and I also had the opportunity of collecting a few testimonies in Australia. And I learned so much. I still keep on learning through the Colombian people in exile, that Colombia out of Colombia. How did we start to work with these people in exile? Let me tell you that we did it from the scratch. It was basically based on what we call trust circles. Whom do we know in this city, in this other country? And out of our own personal networks, we brought those together and we started contacting different people. At the same time, in parallel, we got in touch with institutions in order to collect data, to learn more about the right formal and non-formal statistics, and to also build up better networking with these institutions that were supposed to be protective, or at least aware of the reality of the Colombian people in exile. We worked under snowball methods by reaching out to people that were reaching out to others who were reaching out to others farther and farther. We created a system out of nodos, groups of people that were self-sustained and were holding meetings, deciding on how to approach other people. We trained many of those people to become interviewers, to be able to collect testimonies, putting them in touch with people doing the psychosocial support. Also from Bogota, there were lots of support to Exile chapter in order to be very aware of the different gender realities in exile, considering the age differences, the different generations, also considering people with disabilities, different capacities, and also putting lots of visibility and enhancing the artistic side that is so well linked to resiliency. Lots of public events in order to try to make the Colombian exile more visible in different countries. And we try to disseminate the information on how people, if they wanted to, had the opportunity of sharing their testimony, to be brought to Bogota and be part in a confidential way of the final report of the Truth Commission. We had to disseminate pieces of paper, giving the right email of the Truth Commission for Exile and the telephone numbers that we set in place for such a mission in soccer fields that are crucial under the Colombian culture, also under the Spanish culture, if you like soccer, food shops with Colombian food, churches, different churches, Catholic, evangelical, and dancing discos. Salsa was a very helpful tool in order for us to be able to reach out to Colombians in exile countries. We were also trying to find out about collective cases and patterns of violence. Let me share with you an example. One killing of people around a church probably made large groups of families leave Colombia to be sheltered together in this very specific city in France. That was a collective case. The final report has been delayed, as I already told you. And one of the key hints in order to continue working to make these nodal groups in exile self-sustainable is the devolution. To be very aware that people need to uptake and to appropriate these realities, to do with this report whatever it is that they decide to do. At the very beginning, back in 2018, the coordination between the Truth Commission, the jurisdiction, and the Unit for Disappearances was not very clear. Now, with years going by, somehow this coordination is becoming more clear, although people in exile still have lots of questions about it. Let me share with you a few pictures. I'm aware that time is running out, but we are doing okay, of meetings we had in different places. This previous picture, sorry, yeah, it's one of the meetings we had in the north of Spain with people from very different backgrounds, unionists, indigenous people, Afro-Colombians. This is a meeting of women in Italy, people with different skin colors also in the south of Spain, people in exile in France, people in exile in Brazil, Afro-Colombian people exiled in Canada, indigenous groups, groups of women, indigenous, Afro-Colombians, and peasants also getting together. And again, as I already told you, trying to enhance artwork because it's one of the main tools when working with people. There were also comics made to try to convey the realities of the people in exile. And this one made for people in all different countries, but it was first published in Spain, won the National Prize for Comic this year. That was a very good piece of news. Here are a few examples of groups in exile that I'm just going to leave there for you, but I would like to share with you a couple of minutes of music, because probably at this point you're already a bit tired out of this trip and we only have one more stop to go. Let me see if I am able to share the music with you.
¿Listo? Ya. Sí, sí, sí.
Eso, ahí. Ha llegado el momento de contar mi viaje hasta un destino distante de tierras extrañas y días incontables. Es el despojo de tu tiempo, tu cielo y tu aire. Me ha enseñado a amar de lejos, tu risa sediada por el disparate. Y las fronteras fueron blanqueadas, cruzando selvas, nubes y agua. Abandonarte y en otro aliento poder vivir. Una sentencia entre para quienes son separados de mi presencia, los que han quedado con el vacío de mi vacío. Reconóceme, soy la Colombia exiliada que dejó atrás tu fatiga de guerra y de vida herida. Reconóceme, soy la voz de la expulsión. Esta es mi verdad contada desde las bocas borradas. Este es mi canto sincero por volver a ti, mi casa. Medio millón de sueños es mi equipaje, protegido en desconfianza, seguro mi acento sin evidenciarme. Ausente estoy de nacimientos y oportunidades. Familias, amigos e ideas, un recordatorio de que allí soy nadie. Puse mi cuerpo en todo el planeta, cerrando heridas, buscando el alma. La fe que desde cenizas mustias podía volver a empezar. Hoy desde lejos traigo verdades para una tierra sanada y nueva, y que te entrego como sentido prenda de paz. Reconóceme, soy la Colombia exiliada que dejó atrás tu fatiga de guerra y de vida herida. Reconóceme, soy la voz de la expulsión. Esta es mi verdad contada desde las bocas borradas. Este es mi canto sincero por volver a ti, mi casa.
Somos hijos del exilio que tuvimos que salir. Nuestros padres se marcharon para poder sobrevivir. Esta guerra tan violenta y la paz que nos acerca, y si llega no la dañan y la quieren terminar. Reconózcanos, gritamos miles de exiliados. Contemos la verdad para volver a ser hermanos y sanar el sufrimiento que ha existido tantos años. Reconóceme, yo también soy colombiano y aunque esté en otro país sigo siendo tu paisano.
Reconóceme, soy la Colombia exiliada que dejó atrás tu fatiga de guerra y de vida herida. Reconóceme, soy la voz de la expulsión. Esta es mi verdad contada desde las bocas borradas. Este es mi canto sincero por volver a ti, mi casa. Esta es mi verdad contada desde las bocas borradas.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? I hope so. Okay. So you can, yeah, let me just check. I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, okay. I'm leaving with you a few examples. I mean, the sun is just one of the things that people put together themselves. And as you can see, it's wonderful. There are examples from some other women's groups in exile, like Mujer Diaspora, wonderful pieces of art by the younger generations, documentaries, installations. And there's also a video of Colectiva de Mujeres, which is another group of women, Colombian women in exile, which is kind of a theater piece. And I encourage you to watch it if you are interested. But before we move to the last case, I would like to share with you some of the principles that this last group, Colectiva de Mujeres, Colombian Women in Exile in Europe and South and North America, work under. And when I asked them to put together the principles that they would like to share with you for our session today in a very generous way, people from the younger generation shared this slide with me, okay? And they are saying, our principles are advocacy, transformation, and strengthening somehow the social fabric, always from la ética del cuidado, sororidad y feminismo. That's how they put it together. They have wonderful terms because they are very creative, right? And they talk about how they've been expelled from their own country. Instead of using the word patria, they use the word matria to talk about the mother country, Mother Earth at the same time. And other principle is that, of course, Colombian women in exile are very diverse and they all come together. That's one of the positive impacts of exile. It somehow pushes people to get together in very diverse and multicolored group in that regard. Peasant, urban, indigenous, and Afro-Colombian women, different ages, different generations. The core principle might sound too old feminism, but it's still very present. The private is political, and they work towards peace, transforming their pain and the injustice they've experienced in resiliency and somehow a better being / well-being. Their three main areas of work are, first of all, to contribute to the peace agreement through the collaboration with the three main institutions, Truth Commission, Unit for the Disappeared, and the Judicial Court. Second, to do lots of memory, art, and peace work. And third, to coordinate and to communicate in order to become more visible and to strengthen their own networks. And lastly, here you can read, our space is healing and transformative. We wish to end all types of discrimination. I wanted to share this slide with you because they are doing wonderful work, such as the wonderful work that also Diaspora Woman is doing here. Okay, last stop, as they say in the subway in New York City, right? I would like to put a few minutes to talk about migrants' long trips to Europe. Usually the first part of the trip is very much connected to having to cross a sea, the Mediterranean Sea. Only back last year in 2020, the estimation for the number of people that drowned, who were dead in the Mediterranean Sea in 1 year, last year, was around 950 persons. For forensic anthropologists, finding these remains is one of the top challenges. Finding remains of bodies in water is very difficult, that I learned out of the forensic colleagues we work with. But the Mediterranean Sea, as of now, has sadly become a huge water cemetery, okay? The people that are able to cross the Mediterranean country coming from Asia, coming from the Middle East, coming from Africa, some of them arrived. Greece used to be a very generous country only a few years ago. Unfortunately, that has changed in the last couple of years. And Melissa is a cooperative of migrant women that arrived to Greece more than 20 years ago, who became very aware of the vulnerability of the migrant women that were arriving to Greece in most recent years. And they put together Melissa, which in Greek language means something like a group of bees. It's very much connected to the way bees tend to work together. This cooperative brings together lots of different nationalities. Going into Melissa means running into women from all these different places: Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq and Iran, countries in Africa like Senegal, the Democratic Republic of Congo, CAR as well, the Central African Republic, Nigeria. At Melissa, they have the opportunity of sharing activities like language courses. Most of these women want to learn German because for the majority of them, Germany is the place they still want to go to out of the welfare system and the services they have access to. And they also have English class languages. Of course, they also need to learn Greek, and the younger generations are very good at learning Greek. Sadly, most of these women do not make it to other European countries, and in the last few years, they've remained staying in Greece. They had lots of artistic activities also, as you can see here. They also had psychological support and many groups for mutual support. Some of these groups were held around fun activities like movies or exercising. But at the end of the day, it's all about the psychological well-being, right? I had the opportunity of spending several summers in short slots of time at Melissa, and we shared some activities like this photo voice exercise. When we say photo voice, basically we mean that we ask the women to take pictures with their cell phones. And as of today, almost all of them had cell phones, to take pictures on things that are very important, very significant to them. And later on, we get together, the women show the pictures, they explain to the others why are those pictures important to them. And around these explanations, we tend to talk about different issues. And ultimately, we group those issues and we make groups to talk about the topics that seem to be very important for them. These were some of the topics that were finally selected. Well-being, and you can read by yourself some of the comments, right? In a very abstract way. How important is to feel to be taken care of, caring. Some were saying trust is crucial here at Melissa, and I feel I can trust people and I feel I'm a trusted person, right? The importance of nature when connected to well-being, being in touch with green, with trees, being able to breathe fresh air, being able to walk to the ports in Athens and look at the sea, right? The importance of relationships and understanding as well. Another core topic for them was respect and kindness. They were saying things like, we are together, there's no racism here, apart from the fact that we are very different and we have very different backgrounds. There are no fights. I feel that I listen to people and I'm listened at when I have something to share. Again, there's lots of trust. All this in different languages. Of course, the translation was going back and forth. There are formal translators at Melissa and there's lots of informal translation. Okay. Another top topic for them was learning and education, what we learned here. And they were saying, education is the most important thing I can do now, given my situation. I'm waiting in the hope to be able to make it to another European country different from Greece. But while I'm waiting, I need to get the best education, the best possible opportunities. They were talking about, you can read there, right? How education was connected in their minds to freedom and how it was very important to be able to speak up as well, right? Family was another very significant issue for them. They were talking about the future of the younger generations. They were talking about the chosen family that they found at Melissa and around the surroundings of Melissa. They were also talking as women becoming also a larger family, and somehow the gender realities that made them feel more protected. They were talking mostly, again, about the future generations, right? These are some of the pictures that they shared through this photo voice exercise. When we asked the lady from Afghanistan why she shared this specific picture, she was like, look at the second screen from the left. That's me and my daughter in Germany, Skyping. The picture is very important to me because she's the person I love the most in the world. And I've been able to have access to a computer, and they taught me how to Skype with my daughter. Some people chose not to share pictures, but their own pieces of art. And this is one of them, so you can see here. Another one from a Palestinian young girl. Another one. The younger generations played and still play a major role at Melissa. They are the ones that have the top abilities to learn foreign languages. Most of them attend high school in Greek schools, and they are very successful one way or the other. And these are some of the things that they shared with us in these photo voice groups. I hope you can see this and you can read it. There are no walls here at Melissa. We have good times communicating from the light of our hearts. We were also talking about the children, right? And the way some mothers treated their children, given the cultural differences. That was also kind of a transversal and permanent topic. My dream is to learn a language that will help me to feel better in Europe. Again, first German, then English. The last one is a very interesting statement, and it's very telling about the difference between charity and connecting to these women, younger and older, from a distance, versus being able to listen to them, to accompany them, and to learn from them. In Athens, many churches and organizations were helping migrants and refugees with lots of food and clothes. But lots of these things end up in the garbage. They need to think deeper about us, and we need to organize better our relationship with them so that they can really help us be more powerful, and we can explain to them about the better futures that we want. Ultimately, it's a call for a dialogue, a conversation. Listen to me, I have things to say. I want to be hopeful and believe in more beautiful and successful times. This is the very last station now. You've been very patient with me. The last station I wanted to share with you is the work we are trying to do now. This is my alarm telling me that it's time for you to talk now, but please give me 2 more minutes. This work that we are trying to do now, it's connected to a case of feminicide during the Spanish Civil War. It's a historical memory case. Back in 1938, 1 year after the fascists took over the province that I am living at right now in the north of Spain, Asturias, 8 women were thrown down the cliffs here in Candás, in Asturias, along with 5 men. 13 people in total were put in a truck and they were thrown down the Cabo de Peñas, the Cape of Peñas. There was not a previous war trial. This is the main trait that makes this a feminicide somehow. And this is why the central government is interested in this case. Not only the central government, but of course, the people that are the most interested in this case are the family members, the 3rd and the 4th generations after, who are still in the search for the truth. Not all the bodies, but some bodies were found in the nearby beaches, and out of several attempts to exhumate and to find the remains, only 1 body has been recognized. And we are interviewing the family members. We are trying to collect information, going to different archives in order to put together a publication with pictures that makes this case more visible. And now we are approaching the time for your comments. I will love to listen to you. I will love to answer your questions regarding the things that were not clear enough out of my Spanglish or out of the short time that we've been having. I'm sure you have other examples that you would like to share. I'm very aware that there's lots of work that's been done around cemeteries in the US now, cemeteries from the slavery times. But before that, I would like to wrap up just underlining some of the very basic messages that I've been trying to convey this past hour. How many of these cases are taking place because the legal and formal top-down institutions are not answering to the real needs of gender groups, mostly of women's groups. How these processes are very genuine, very grassroots, and they tend to bring together experiences of survivors that are very different, and still they do share the similarity of having the same goals, resiliency, and achieving peace one way or the other. And how in most of these cases, there's a very clear integration of both the private and the political. I wanted to share a last quote with you from Audre Lorde, talking about silences and talking about visibility. And a very last one from Almudena Grandes, who is a Spanish writer that died just a few days ago. And she has done amazing work on historical memory, describing many situations from the Spanish Civil War, so that the younger generations will be able to be aware of what happened 80 years ago, right? And the impacts that it has had in the later generations. She's talking about joy, and she's talking about not only personal joy, but also the joy that we get and all the things that we learn when we have the opportunity of working with survivors. I can tell you that my life is so much better thanks to all the things that I got from these people in the cases that we've been sharing. It's not only about learning how to dance better salsa, but also being in this circle of the contagious joy of Colombian people and their efforts in order to put together better lives, or the migrant women arriving to Greece, or the women from the Balkans that are still fighting in order to put together a better country and better countryside, right? I have lots of resources that I will be very happy to share with you if you are interested, but mostly I want to thank you for your patience up to now, and now it's your turn. So I really look forward to get your comments and questions. Thank you, thanks very much.
Thank you, Arantxa. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So we have a first question from Juana Corral. How do these women from different parts of the world find the strength and resilience to keep fighting?
Gracias, Juana. Juana creo que está en Alemania, la conozco. And she's great. I think that, Juana, you yourself can give us an answer, right? But what I've learned from many of these women is that being broken down is a way of resistance, and wanting better futures for your children and for the kids that are part of the future is also a very powerful strength. When you rely mostly on the hopes that things can change and people can have better futures, that's a great impulse. But I'm sure that, Juana, you have comments yourself, and I will love to hear those because of your own experiences.
Thank you, Arantxa. Son Finan from Northern Ireland, I hope I pronounced correctly your name. He wants to thank you for a wonderful presentation. He was privileged to meet with women in Black during one of his many visits to the Balkans, and he has the written records from the women's courts, compelling reading, and an important record from the conflict wars in the Balkans. He says, we do not hear women's voices and stories enough. Thank you. I think that was something that I was, if I may, Arantxa, interested in. Who are the listeners? So I feel that there's a lot of work with women groups, and I wonder if there's someone on the other side hearing their voices and learning from their experiences.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for the question. Thank you so much to the person from Northern Ireland. You know, that's another very interesting case that I hope we can learn more about. Yeah, at the Women's Court, because of the 3 years of previous preparations, there were lots of exchanges, right? First, it's mostly survivor women listening to each other, with the mediation of some women from Women in Black. Then it is true that there's training in order for these women to put together their strength in order to be able to go up on stage and share their testimonies in front of a large group of people. And that requires time and that requires support, right? The listeners were the other women from all the different states in the Balkans, but also women that they had invited. We had the privilege of being invited there because of our connection either with Women in Black or with some of the survivors that were sharing their testimonies. But I have to say that in person, the attendance to the Women's Court in Sarajevo was very much under the control of the organizers. As of today, there are publications in different languages. And again, also there was a group of so-called experts listening and making the reports, the daily reports and the final reports. And most of these women were women also from the 6 states of the Balkans who had an academic background. There were lawyers, there were sociologists, there were doctors, there were psychiatrists. I remember some of those. And you can read their names in these publications. But to answer your question, Mariajo, and I hope I'm clear enough, first, it's mostly like mutual listening. Then it becomes listening more one-to-one, and ultimately it's preparing people in order to be able to share their testimony in large audiences. Ideally, if this can be published with the names of the victims when they give their permission or in a confidential way, that's wonderful, because these are experiences that we can learn a lot from in order to be applied to different contexts. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. We have another question from Madeleine Drew. What we can do as a society to help women, refugee, asylum, integrate and feel comfortable in their new location. I notice sometimes they feel so lost. I know learning the language is important. Thank you, Madeleine Drew, Fairfield, Connecticut, US.
Thanks, Madeleine. Madeleine is also one woman with lots of experience because she's been in the US for a long time. I'm aware of that. And I think that just telling them about your own experience and how you've been able, because I'm very aware that that's your case, to bring together the new cultural experience of the United States of North America, while keeping your Colombia background from Cali, it's a way of reassuring that people can learn and get multiple identities and to become more enriched in that regard. But going back to very simple things, I always think it's about listening and talking and sharing very basic experiences. I remember how useful it was for me at first when I was a privileged migrant, which is not a comparable example, but still, in the US to have people going with me to the bank, to the doctor, or just to the train station, because those systems and those things are unfamiliar. And creating routines gives us a sense of safety that enables somehow a closer relationships. And at the end of the day, it's about well-being. I hope I was able to answer your question partially, Madeleine. Thank you. Thanks for it.
See, also thank you. From Maria Aguilar, what do you think are some of the collective obstacles women navigating transitional justice continue to face within justice systems that continue to be patriarchal and racist? I'm thinking about some of the cases you mentioned and also transitional cases in Guatemala where the groups affected were indigenous women.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think that there are many obstacles that are very much connected to law and regulations, and the fact that law is not still ready to face gender realities. Guatemala is a great example. I'm just so sorry that we didn't have enough time to talk about it. I know very little about Guatemala, and there are wonderful people very close to Yale, like Brinton Likes or Alison Crosby, right, who are top experts and they have wonderful publications. I'm thinking about the most recent publication by Brinton in which they, and Alison Crosby, in which they do describe some of these obstacles, you know. Law regulations that are not updated. It's also the fact that many of these women are not reached out by the formal institutions that belong to the transitional justice mechanisms, either because they are in faraway places or either because they don't speak the formal official languages, or either because they still feel broken down, too ashamed, too guilty, too much in pain, too traumatized in order to be able to share their experiences. And this requires a timing that many times does not match the timing of these justice institutions. I know my answer is very basic, and it will require probably a whole semester to try to tackle on some of these issues. But thank you for the question, Maria.
Thank you, Arantxa. Let's give a couple of one more minute maybe to see if other questions pop up. I think that one of the aspects that I was more newer to me from the perspective of someone who works on or has read about transitional justice from political science is this aspect of timing, which is so crucial and so important in incorporating the victims. Son Finan is sharing a documentary on YouTube about women's experiences of the conflict in Dari. I'm going to save this resource, and maybe after there would be opportunities to share your slides and this the beautiful song you share with us and Son's YouTube video in the website of the event.
Oh, definitely. Seriously, I mean, the slides are meant for you to have them, and if you are interested to put enough time into the links and into doing further research. I'm very aware that I shared with you a very basic description of very complex topics, right? But I'd rather do so, as I told you at the beginning, in order for you to get an overview of several different cases. But yeah, when you go to these links, you'll be very aware that, wow, there are lots of wonderful resources. And the younger generations are doing great work when disseminating these realities, not only from academic perspectives, but also from artistic approaches and using lots of different tools. that are usually, let me say this, much more useful than thick books and even thick research in order to reach out to the average population that is interested but unaware about the nature of the conflicts.
We have maybe the last question for you from Sarah Berenice Monsalvo Basualda. I hope I have pronounced her name correctly. It has been an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. All these conflict and post scenarios have been interesting understandings about the type of conflict, justice and memory. For sure, testimonies and accompanying are crucial to develop more reality link projects. What has been the importance of using intersectionality for you?
It's crucial. I mean, that's something that I've learned along the way. I think that the term, that still sounds weird to me. I don't know if it's because of the translation to Spanish or not, but when we talk about bringing different exclusions and discriminations together, it's something that I got to learn as I was trying to learn how to listen better, and it's a never-ending learning, and how to understand better realities that are so far away from our own personal and professional backgrounds, right? So more and more, we tend to find that it's very difficult to find survivors that experience just one type of discrimination. And if we put enough time and if we scratch a little bit the things that they want to share with us, we'll find intersectionality all around, you know? It's about women that have experienced discrimination out of their age, out of the color of their skin, out of their educational backgrounds, and out of the different sources that were not protecting them. I would dare to say that intersectionality, the accumulation of discriminations, happens to almost every single survivor, and I would go even further, to almost every single woman.
Thank you, Arantxa. I think that that's it. I have saved the chat so you can see the comments that you got from the audience. I want to thank everybody for participating and attending this wonderful webinar. I thank you, Arantxa, for being willing to share with us your experience and how much you know on justice and women in the so-called post-conflict situations. And I thank you, the sponsors, the Council of Latin American Studies, the Council of European Studies, and the Program on Peace and Development for sponsoring the event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Maria Jose and Aisha.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.